Margaret's hands shook as she lifted the knife. The raw chicken blurred through her tears. 4 hours until dinner. 15 starving men. A stove she didn't know how to light. And a rancher who'd just walked away after saying the cruelest kindness she'd ever heard. "I don't need someone who can cook, Mrs. Sullivan. I need someone who remembers what hope tastes like." She pressed her palm against the cold iron. Philadelphia seemed like another lifetime. Charles was dead. The creditors had taken everything. And this kitchen, this impossible, terrifying kitchen, was her last chance at surviving. Before we continue Margaret's story, if you're watching from anywhere in this beautiful world, drop a comment with your city name. I want to see how far these frontier tales travel. And please, hit that subscribe button. This is a long journey, 2 hours of heartbreak and healing, and I promise you, it's worth every minute. Now let's step back to where it all began. The stagecoach door slammed open before the wheels stopped rolling. Margaret Sullivan hit the ground hard, her worn boots sending up clouds of red dust that coated her black mourning dress, the same dress she'd worn to Charles's grave, to the creditor's office, to the pawn shop where she'd sold her mother's pearls for $17. Not enough. Never enough. "Willow Creek," the driver barked. End of line. She stood there clutching 2 carpet bags that held everything she owned. 3 dresses, a hairbrush, her marriage certificate, and a folded newspaper advertisement that had brought her 800 miles from Philadelphia to this godforsaken stretch of Montana territory. The town stretched before her like a broken promise. One rutted street. Buildings that looked like they'd collapse in a strong wind. Men loitering outside the Lucky Strike saloon who stopped their conversation to stare at her with eyes that stripped away pretense and saw exactly what she was desperate. A woman alone was bad enough. A widow with refined speech and soft hands was practically a circus act. Margaret lifted her chin and walked toward Morrison's general store. Her spine straight, her face composed, the way she'd been taught by a mother who'd never imagined her daughter would end up here begging for work as a cook when she'd never cooked a proper meal in her life. The bell jangled harsh against her nerves. "Help you?" The man behind the counter looked up from his ledger. Spectacles, thin face, suspicious eyes that took in her expensive dress and cheap luggage. "I'm inquiring about the position." Margaret pulled out the advertisement with fingers that wanted to tremble. "The Circle M Ranch. The cook position." His eyebrows shot up. "That posting's been up 2 months, ma'am." "I'm aware. The ranch is 20 miles out. Rough country. No other women. Just—" He gestured vaguely at her. "It ain't for ladies." "Mr. Morrison, I presume." She kept her voice level. "I assure you I'm quite capable." "Can you cook?" The lie came easier than breathing. "Yes." "Over a wood stove, in a kitchen that feeds 15 men 3 times a day, bake bread from scratch, butcher chickens. I'm a quick study." Morrison set down his pen, studied her long enough that she felt her carefully constructed composure start to crack. "Ma'am, I'll be plain. Jake Caldwell's a fair man, but he's got no patience for foolishness. That ranch has broken stronger folk than you appear to be. Last cook walked off into the prairie rather than stay another day." Perhaps she lacked sufficient motivation. Margaret met his gaze. "I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Morrison. No family, no means. I need this position." The words hung naked in the air between them. Something shifted in his expression. "Supply wagon leaves at dawn. You can ride out with Pete if you're certain." "I'm certain." "Then you'll need different clothes." He nodded toward the pitiful selection of women's garments. "What you're wearing won't last a week." Margaret looked down at her morning dress. Black silk that had cost Charles a month's salary back when he was still hiding their debts behind champagne and opera tickets. She bought 2 calico dresses with the last of her money. Sturdy boots that felt like iron on her feet. A wide-brimmed hat that would have horrified her Philadelphia friends. "Mrs. Patterson runs the boarding house," Morrison said as he wrapped her purchases. "Tell her I sent you." He paused, something almost kind crossing his weathered face. "What brings a lady like you to Willow Creek? You've got education in your voice. Refinement. This ain't your world." Margaret pulled on her gloves, kid leather worn thin at the fingertips. "My husband was a doctor, a drunk and a gambler, though I didn't know the extent until after the laudanum killed him. Possibly an accident. I choose to believe it was." The confession came out flat, factual. The debts took everything, the house, his practice, even the furniture. "I have no children, Mr. Morrison, and my family made it clear that a scandalous widow was not welcome." "I'm sorry for your loss." "Don't be. I'm not." She gathered her packages. "I'm tired of being sorry. I'd rather be useful." The boarding house was worse than she'd expected. Peeling paint, sagging porch. Mrs. Patterson answered the door with sharp eyes that cataloged Margaret's worth in 3 seconds flat. "You're the one going to the Circle M." "Yes, ma'am." Brave or foolish, can't decide which. But she showed Margaret to a small, clean room. "You ever meet Jake Caldwell?" "Not yet." Mrs. Patterson snorted. "Don't expect charm. Man's colder than January creek water. Handsome if you like them weathered and silent. Lost his wife and baby girl to cholera years back. Some say it broke something in him that never healed." After she left, Margaret sat on the narrow bed and finally let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. 800 miles. Everything she'd known gone. Everything she'd been irrelevant. Tomorrow she'd ride to a ranch run by a broken man to cook for cowboys she'd never met, using skills she didn't possess in a kitchen that had defeated every woman before her. She pulled out the advertisement one more time. Such small words to have brought her so far. Circle M. Ranch seeks cook. Room and board provided. Inquire at Morrison's General Store, Willow Creek. No mention of salary. No details about the work. Just those bare facts that had looked like salvation when she'd found them in a newspaper someone had left on a train station bench. Margaret lay back on the bed, still dressed, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. The sounds of the frontier town filtered through the thin walls. Piano music from the saloon. Men's rough laughter. Horses stamping in the street. A woman's voice singing something mournful in Spanish. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like. The supply wagon jolted over ruts that seemed designed to break bones. Margaret gripped the wooden seat and tried not to vomit as old Pete navigated them across 20 miles of prairie that stretched endless as an ocean. The morning sun climbed hot and merciless. Her new calico dress already stuck to her back with sweat. Pete hadn't spoken since they'd left town at dawn. Just the creak of wheels and the jingle of harness and the vast, empty silence of Montana pressing in from all sides. Then he pointed. Circle M boundary. 3 miles to the house. Margaret's stomach clenched. The ranch appeared gradually, first the fence line, then the corrals, then the buildings scattered across a natural bowl in the prairie. Larger than she'd expected, more established. The main house was solid logs and rough planks. A big barn, bunkhouse, various outbuildings that spoke of years of hard work. But no flowers, no curtains. No softness anywhere. Pete pulled up in front of the main house. "Wait here, I'll fetch Jake." She waited, spine straight, hands folded over her carpet bag, while her heart hammered against her ribs. The door opened. Margaret's breath caught. Jake Caldwell wasn't old or slovenly or any of the things she'd half expected. He was maybe 40 tall and lean with the kind of strength that came from breaking horses and mending fences. Dark hair touched with gray at the temples, a face weathered by sun and wind and loss, and eyes gray as a winter storm that looked at her with absolutely no expression at all. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, thumbs hooked in his belt, silent. The silence stretched until Margaret wanted to scream just to break it. "Mrs. Sullivan," Pete said, clearly uncomfortable. "About the cook position." Jake's gaze never left her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured with a Texas drawl that surprised her. You ever cook for 15 hungry men, Mrs. Sullivan? No. But you're willing to learn. It wasn't a question. Still, she answered. Yes. This isn't a schoolhouse. He took a step closer. I need someone who can do the job, not someone who might learn eventually. Then why has the position been vacant for 2 months? Something flickered in those storm-colored eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or approval. Because most folks are smart enough to know better. He came closer, still close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes. Ranch cooking means up at 4, breakfast on the table by 5, lunch packed for the range riders, dinner ready when they return. It means baking bread, preserving meat, maintaining supplies, and doing it all on a wood stove that has moods like a fractious horse. I understand. Do you... His voice went softer, dangerous. Can you lift a full pot of stew, haul water from the well, kill and pluck a chicken because there's nobody here to do it for you? Margaret looked him straight in those cold gray eyes. Mr. Caldwell, 3 months ago, I buried my husband and discovered I was penniless. 2 months ago, I sold everything I owned to pay debts that weren't even mine. 1 month ago, I slept in a railway station because I couldn't afford lodging. Her voice stayed steady, even as her hands shook. I've learned that necessity is an excellent teacher. Silence again. But different now. Bring her bags to the kitchen, he told Pete without looking away from her face. Does that mean? It means you get 1 week to prove you can handle it. If you can't, Pete takes you back to town with the next supply run. He started toward the house, then stopped, turned back. One more thing, Mrs. Sullivan. The men who work here are good men, but they're cowboys. They curse, they smell like horses, and they haven't seen a woman in months. You'll eat in the kitchen, keep to the house after dark, and maintain appropriate distance. Clear. Perfectly clear. Good. He was almost through the door when he paused again. You said you were willing to learn. Are you also willing to laugh? The question hit her like a slap. I beg your pardon? This is a hard life. He turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw something other than coldness in his expression. Something raw. Tired. The work breaks backs, and the loneliness breaks spirits. The last cook spent every meal looking like she was attending a funeral. It affected the men, made everything heavier than it needed to be. He studied her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. So, I'll ask again, Mrs. Sullivan. Can you cook with laughter? Can you bring something besides food to that kitchen? Margaret thought of the dinner parties she'd hosted when Charles was alive. The way she'd kept conversation flowing and guests smiling even when the roast was overdone, or she could smell whiskey on her husband's breath. Mr. Caldwell, I once kept 20 Philadelphia Society matrons entertained for 3 hours when my cook quit without notice, and I had to prepare the meal myself while pretending nothing was wrong. She lifted her chin. If I could manage that, I believe I can handle cowboys. This time she was certain she saw approval. The kitchen's through here. He led her inside. I'll show you the quarters and explain the routine. Dinner's at 6 sharp. That gives you... He pulled out a pocket watch. 4 hours to figure out that stove and feed 15 men. Margaret's heart dropped into her boots. Still want the job? She thought of the 800 miles behind her, the empty pockets, the shame she'd left in Philadelphia. The fact that this impossible kitchen with its monster stove and unreasonable deadline was her last chance at having any kind of life at all. Lead the way, Mr. Caldwell. The kitchen was vast and primitive and utterly terrifying. The cast-iron stove dominated one wall like a black iron beast. The wood box beside it was nearly empty. A long, scarred table occupied the center. Open shelves held mismatched dishes and battered pots. Everything was clean, but utterly without warmth or personality. Your room, Jake indicated a door off the kitchen. It's small but private. Water's in the barrel by the stove, we haul it from the well each morning. Firewood's out back. Root cellar's behind the house. Smokehouse is the small building to the left. He moved to the stove, checking the firebox with practiced hands. This beast takes some getting used to. Too much wood and she burns everything. Too little and nothing cooks through. The dampers are temperamental, and the oven runs hot on the right side. Margaret stared at the stove. It looked like it wanted to eat her alive. Any other peculiarities I should know about? Men like their coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Breakfast is always biscuits, bacon, or salt pork eggs when we have them gravy. Lunch for the range riders is cold biscuits, dried beef, whatever travels well. Dinner's the big meal. Meat, potatoes, vegetables if we have them. He paused. Pie if you can manage it. Pie. The men work hard, Mrs. Sullivan. Good food's one of the few pleasures out here. He moved toward the door, then stopped. 1 week. If you're still here after that, we'll discuss wages and permanent arrangements. Mr. Caldwell. He paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon light. You asked if I could cook with laughter. May I ask why that matters to you? For a long moment, he didn't answer. Just stood there, shoulders tight, something painful working across his weathered face. Because I've lived 10 years in a house that forgot how to smile, Mrs. Sullivan. His voice went rough, raw. Sometimes a man gets tired of the silence. Then he was gone. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen that would either save her or destroy her. 4 hours. She set down her carpet bag and surveyed her domain with growing panic. She'd hosted elaborate dinner parties, yes, but there'd been a cook, kitchen maids, a butler to serve. She'd managed menus and seating arrangements and conversation, not actual food preparation. She found an apron hanging on a peg and tied it with shaking hands. First things first. Fire. The matches were easy to find. Getting the fire started was not. It took 6 attempts and language that would have scandalized her Philadelphia friends before flames finally caught and began to eat the kindling. Now what? The pantry revealed sacks of flour and beans, potatoes, onions, a quarter of beef hanging in the cold corner. She could make stew. How hard could it be? Meat, vegetables, water, seasonings. Simple. 2 hours later, Margaret stood before the stove fighting back tears of pure frustration. The stew pot was too heavy to lift when full. She'd had to ladle water in 1 cup at a time. The vegetables were unevenly chopped because the knives were dull and her hands were already blistering. The fire kept dying, then roaring back when she added wood, making everything alternate between barely simmering and boiling over. You look like you're wrestling a bear, ma'am. She spun around to find a young cowboy in the doorway. Maybe 20 with sandy hair and a friendly freckled face. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Tom Bradley. Jake sent me to see if you needed firewood brought in. Yes, please. Margaret pushed hair out of her face with a flour-dusted hand. Tom, have you eaten many stews made by the previous cooks? Yes, ma'am. What made them good? He grinned. Mostly that they were hot and there was plenty. Cowboys aren't too particular after a long day. He started stacking wood by the stove. Though Jake's got more refined tastes than the rest of us. Comes from being raised proper, I expect. Mr. Caldwell was raised properly. So they say. Good family back in Texas. Maybe even went to one of those fancy colleges. Tom kept his voice casual, but she sensed he was testing her, seeing if she'd gossip. But something happened. Nobody knows what. And he ended up out here. Margaret filed this away and focused on not burning the stew. By the time the dinner bell rang, an actual bell mounted on a post outside, she'd managed to produce stew that looked edible, biscuits that were only slightly burned on the bottom, and coffee that could indeed float a horseshoe. The cowboys filed in, each nodding politely and mumbling "ma'am" as they took their seats. Rough men with sun-weathered faces and hands scarred from hard work. But their eyes held respect, curiosity, and something like hope. Jake entered last, took his seat at the head of the table without a word. His eyes surveyed the simple meal, then rose to meet hers. Gentlemen, he said quietly, this is Mrs. Sullivan, our new cook. Mind your manners. The meal passed in relative quiet. The clink of spoons against bowls, Requests for more biscuits passed in low voices. Margaret stood by the stove, watching anxiously as the men ate. No one complained, but no one complimented either. She noticed Jake ate slowly, deliberately, as if evaluating each bite. When the last man pushed back from the table, Jake stood. "Mrs. Sullivan, a word?" She followed him onto the back porch, where the setting sun painted the prairie gold and crimson. Her hands twisted in her apron as she waited for the verdict that would determine whether she had a future or would be sent back to Philadelphia with nothing. "The stew was underseasoned," he said bluntly. "The biscuits were heavy, and the coffee could strip paint." Her heart sank. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth quirked upward. "But you kept trying even when that stove was getting the better of you. And you asked Tom for advice instead of pretending you knew everything." He looked out over the prairie profile sharp against the dying light. "That shows sense. Does that mean I can stay? It means you get your week like I promised." He turned back to her. "Can you read and write, Mrs. Sullivan?" "Of course." "Good. The ranch accounts need keeping, and my penmanship's terrible. If you can manage the books along with the cooking, I'll add extra to your wages." He started to leave, then paused. "Remember what I said about laughter. A good meal fills the stomach. A cheerful kitchen fills something else, something harder to name, but just as important." As he walked away toward the bunkhouse, Margaret stood there in the gathering darkness, covered in flour and smelling of wood smoke, her hands raw and her back aching. But for the first time in months, she felt something besides despair. It might have been hope, or it might have simply been exhaustion. Either way, she'd survived her first meal. Only 6 days and 18 meals to go before Jake Caldwell decided whether she was worth keeping. Margaret returned to the kitchen and faced the mountain of dishes. The water had to be heated on the stove, the plates scrubbed by hand, everything put away on those high shelves that required standing on a chair to reach. Her hands bled where blisters had formed and broken. She was washing the last pot when footsteps sounded behind her. "You're still awake." Jake stood in the doorway holding something wrapped in cloth. "Thought you'd have collapsed by now." "I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Caldwell. Call me Jake. After hours when it's just talk." He set the bundle on the table and unwrapped it, a worn cookbook. "This belonged to my mother. She used it when she was first married before she had help. The recipes are simple but good." Margaret picked it up reverently. The pages were stained, the margins filled with notes in feminine handwriting. Texas receipts for the frontier wife. "Your mother lived on a ranch, small spread outside San Antonio. Nothing like this. They were respectable folk. My mother was raised in New Orleans, came to Texas as a bride." Something distant crossed his face. She used to say the stove nearly defeated her those first months, but she learned. Even came to love it in time. "What happened to them?" His expression shuddered completely. "Comanche raided when I was away at college. I came back to ashes and graves." He cleared his throat. "The book's yours to use. Mind you take care of it." He was gone before she could respond. Margaret stood holding the cookbook, this precious thing he'd entrusted to her, and understood a bit more about the shadows in Jake Caldwell's eyes. She opened it carefully, found a recipe for biscuits with a note in the margin. "If the dough seems dry, add sweet milk 1 spoon at a time. Another for stew. This burns easy. Watch close." And on a recipe for apple pie in fading ink. Jake's favorite, extra cinnamon. Written by a mother who'd never seen her son grow to full manhood, who'd taught him to appreciate good food and laughter and all the things he'd lost when the Comanche took everything. Margaret pressed the book to her chest and let herself cry. Not from exhaustion or frustration or fear, but from gratitude that this hard, wounded man had trusted her with something so precious. Tomorrow she'd study these recipes. She'd learn this beast of a stove. She'd prove to Jake Caldwell that she was worth keeping. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because somewhere in the past 4 hours of chaos and failure and small victories, she'd started to believe she might actually belong here. In this kitchen that forgot how to smile, with these cowboys who needed someone to cook with laughter, and this broken rancher who'd buried his heart with his family and was only now beginning to remember what hope tasted like. Margaret Sullivan, who'd arrived with nothing but shame and desperation, dried her tears and began planning tomorrow's breakfast. The Philadelphia widow was gone. In her place stood something new, something stronger, a frontier woman in the making. The second morning dawned with disaster. Margaret woke to the acrid smell of smoke and bolted from her room to find the biscuits she'd set to bake transformed into charcoal bricks. The coffee pot had boiled over, dousing half the fire and filling the kitchen with wet ash and grounds. In her panic to salvage something, she knocked over the milk pail, sending yesterday's precious collection streaming across the floor. "Lord have mercy!" She grabbed a rag and dropped to her knees, scrubbing frantically. "Damn this infernal stove!" "Language, Mrs. Sullivan." She whirled to find Jake standing in the doorway, already dressed for the day's work, watching her with those unreadable storm-colored eyes. Heat flooded her cheeks, whether from embarrassment or the smoking oven she couldn't say. "I apologize, Mr. Caldwell. I set the dampers wrong, and then everything just—" She gestured helplessly at the chaos. "The men will be here in 20 minutes. He surveyed the damage without expression. Margaret wanted to sink through the floorboards. 2 days, and she was already failing. "I understand. If you want to send me back with Pete, I'll gather my things." "Did I say that?" He rolled up his sleeves and moved to the stove with the easy confidence of someone who knew what he was doing. "Watch and learn. First bank the coals like this when you're baking. The dampers need to be barely open, not wide." His hands worked quickly, adjusting metal levers. "Second, always set something on the counter to remind you what's in the oven. A spoon, a cup, anything to catch your eye. You know how to cook." "Had to learn when we couldn't keep help." He was already reaching for a bowl. "Now for salvaging breakfast, the men need to eat burned biscuits or no. You've got flour." "Yes, but there's no time for new biscuits." "Pancakes, faster than biscuits and more forgiving. You mix while I get this fire sorted." They worked side by side in surprising harmony. Jake handled the temperamental stove, while Margaret mixed batter with shaking hands, sliced salt pork, started fresh coffee. When Tom appeared with the morning's eggs, Jake set him to cooking them in a massive skillet. "Since when do you know your way around a kitchen?" Tom asked, grinning at his boss. "Since I spent 3 months cooking for myself and the crew because we couldn't keep help." Jake's voice was curt. Sometimes a man learns skills he'd rather not need. The cowboys filed in to find pancakes, eggs, and salt pork waiting. If they noticed their boss wiping flour from his hands, they were wise enough not to comment. Margaret watched Jake take his usual seat, his expression giving away nothing of the morning's chaos. After the men left, she faced the dishes with a heavy heart. Her beautiful hands, which had once played Chopin on a rosewood piano, were already red and chapped from lye soap. Giving up already? She turned to find Jake had returned carrying a bucket of water. "I'm not giving up. I'm simply reconsidering my capabilities." "Good. Doubt keeps us humble." He set the bucket on the counter. "But here's something to help with the reconsidering." He produced a small tin from his pocket. "Hand salve. My mother's recipe: beeswax, lanolin, and lavender. The work here is hard on hands. No shame in protecting them." Margaret took the tin, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you." "Can't have our cook unable to hold a knife." He started to leave, then paused. "You did well this morning. Kept your head when things went wrong. That matters more than perfect biscuits." "I burned them to cinders." "And then you adapted. That's what frontier life requires, Mrs. Sullivan. Not perfection, just the willingness to keep trying when everything goes to hell." After he left, Margaret opened the tin and breathed in the scent of lavender. She rubbed the salve into her damaged hands and felt something crack open in her chest. Kindness. Real kindness. Not the performative charity of Philadelphia society where helping the less fortunate was something you did to be seen doing it, but practical, thoughtful care from a man who noticed when someone was hurting. She studied his mother's cookbook with new determination. Today, she'd master biscuits, tomorrow bread. By the end of the week, she'd prove to Jake Caldwell that his faith in her wasn't misplaced. The morning flew by as she worked through the recipes. The notes in the margins became her guide, little pieces of wisdom from a woman who'd walked this path before her. By noon, she'd packed lunches for the range riders and started bread dough rising for dinner. She was elbow-deep in flour, kneading the second batch, when she heard commotion outside. Through the window, she saw several cowboys gathered around someone on the ground. Her heart lurched as she recognized Tom Bradley's sandy hair. He was the one down clutching his arm, his face pale with pain. Margaret didn't think, just ran. What happened? Horse spooked and threw him. One of the men Bill, she thought, gestured at Tom's arm. Think it's broke. Bring him to the kitchen, carefully now. They carried Tom in and set him on the bench by the table. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His arm hung at an unnatural angle that made Margaret's stomach clench. But her hands stayed steady as she gently probed the injury. Years of being Charles's assistant, of holding instruments and following his terse instructions when he was sober enough to work, all of it came flooding back. It's broken, but cleanly. She looked up at the assembled cowboys. I can set it, but I'll need help. You know how? Tom's voice came out thin with pain. My husband was a physician. I've assisted him many times. She turned to the others. I need straight boards for splints, clean cloth for bandages, and someone to hold him steady. Jake appeared in the doorway, took in the scene with a single glance and began issuing orders. Within minutes, Margaret had everything she needed. Jake positioned himself behind Tom, holding the young man's shoulders in a grip that was both gentle and immovable. This will hurt, Margaret warned, meeting Tom's frightened eyes. But it'll hurt worse if we leave it. Just do it, ma'am. She felt along the brake one more time. Then, with a quick, sure movement, born of watching Charles do this dozens of times, she pulled and aligned the bones. Tom's yell could probably be heard in the next county. But the arm was straight. She splinted it carefully, wrapping it with torn strips of clean cloth, the last of her good petticoat. But she didn't care. When she tied off the final bandage, her hands were trembling. There. Keep it still for 6 weeks. I'll make a sling. Thank you, ma'am. Tom's voice was weak. Thought I'd have to ride all the way to town. You'd have been lucky to make it halfway. Jake's voice was rough. He looked at Margaret with something like respect. Where did a Philadelphia lady learn to set bones? The truth came out before she could stop it. When you're married to a doctor who drinks Mr. Caldwell, you learn to handle things when his hands aren't steady enough. Silence fell over the kitchen. Margaret busied herself making a sling from a dish towel, her cheeks burning. She'd never spoken of Charles's weakness to anyone outside their household. It was shameful, humiliating, the kind of secret you buried deep and never acknowledged. Well, Jake said finally. We're grateful for the skill, whatever brought it. The men filed out, supporting Tom between them. Jake lingered, watching as Margaret returned to her bread dough with hands that shook. Your husband, he said quietly. Is that what broke you? The drinking. Margaret's hands stilled in the flour. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Couldn't. The words were stuck somewhere between her heart and her throat. No, I could forgive the drinking. It was a weakness, but he was a good man despite it. She resumed kneading, perhaps more forcefully than necessary. What broke me was discovering he'd been hiding our debts for years, borrowing against future earnings, selling my jewelry, and replacing it with paste. Her voice went bitter. He didn't want me to worry, he said in his final letter. Instead, he left me to face the creditors alone. He killed himself. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded anyway. Laudanum overdose. Possibly accidental, he'd been taking it for pain. I choose to believe it was. She shaped the dough into a loaf with practiced motions. And now you know why a refined Philadelphia widow is burning biscuits in a Montana ranch kitchen, Mr. Caldwell. Jake, he corrected softly, and we all have our reasons for being here. Tom will heal clean thanks to you. That matters more than perfect biscuits. He started to leave, then turned back. There's apple pie in my mother's book, page 47. The men haven't had pie in months. Might make them forget this morning's breakfast disaster. A challenge and a kindness wrapped in one. Assuming I can manage the oven temperature. You'll manage. His eyes held something she couldn't quite read. You've got stubborn written all over you, Mrs. Sullivan. After he left, Margaret attacked the bread with renewed energy. She would make this work. Not just the bread or the pie or surviving the week. All of it. This life. This place. These people who were beginning to feel less like strangers and more like something she couldn't quite name yet. Family, maybe. The thought terrified her. The apple pie turned out lopsided and too sweet. She'd forgotten to add sugar, at first remembered just in time, and probably overcompensated. The crust was thick in some places, thin in others. But when she set it on the table after dinner, the cowboys' faces lit up like children at Christmas. Pie, someone exclaimed. Hot damn, excuse me, ma'am, hot dog. We got pie. Even Jake's stoic expression cracked slightly as he took a bite. Not bad, Mrs. Sullivan. It's too sweet. It's pie, Tom said, eating left-handed with his arm in its sling. Could be made of sawdust, and we'd still love it. The men laughed, and suddenly the kitchen felt warmer, more alive. Margaret found herself smiling as she served seconds to eager cowboys who complimented her with their enthusiasm more than any Philadelphia society matron ever had with polite words. Save room for tomorrow, she warned. I'm attempting donuts if I can figure out the oil temperature. Donuts! A cowboy named Bill looked ready to weep with joy. Ma'am, if you make donuts, I'll marry you myself. Get in line, another said, and the table erupted in good-natured ribbing. Enough! Jake's voice cut through the laughter, but Margaret caught the slight upturn of his mouth. Mrs. Sullivan isn't here for your entertainment. As the men filed out, each thanking her more profusely than the last, Margaret felt warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. She'd fed them, tended their hurt, made them smile. It was harder work than she'd ever done, but somehow more satisfying too. Jake was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at her standing amid the dinner debris, apron stained and hair escaping its pins. My mother used to say a kitchen without laughter was just a room with a stove. His voice went quiet, almost vulnerable. Tonight felt like a kitchen again. Then he was gone, leaving Margaret to wonder at the lonely man who'd hired her to season his life with more than salt and pepper. She washed the dishes while humming an old hymn her grandmother used to sing. Didn't notice Jake standing outside the window listening to the almost forgotten sound of music in his kitchen, before he finally turned and walked back to his empty house under the vast Montana stars. The days began folding into each other like well-kneaded dough. Margaret rose before dawn without needing the rooster's crow. Her hands found matches and kindling in the dark by instinct now. The temperamental stove had become, if not a friend, at least a predictable adversary whose moods she could anticipate. Small changes crept in gradually. Checkered curtains appeared at the window sewn from a worn tablecloth she'd found in storage. A jar of late wildflowers sat on the table, gathered during her rare walks to the well. She'd discovered mint, growing wild behind the smokehouse, and hung dried bunches from the rafters, filling the air with green freshness. Smells like my grandmother's kitchen, Tom said one morning, arriving early, as had become his habit. His arm was healing well, though he still wore the sling. He'd taken to sitting at the table while Margaret worked, keeping her company with easy chatter about ranch life. Did she cook on a ranch too? Margaret slid a pan of perfect golden biscuits into the oven. No, ma'am. She had a little house in Missouri, but she grew herbs everywhere. Said a kitchen without growing things was like a church without hymns. Margaret smiled, crimping the edges of a pie crust. She'd mastered Jake's mother's apple pie recipe and was now experimenting with dried berry fillings. "Your grandmother sounds wise." She was. Tom accepted the cup of coffee she handed him. "Used to say you could tell everything about a house by its kitchen, whether folks were happy or just getting by." He looked around the transformed space, the curtains, the flowers, the bunches of herbs, the smell of baking bread. "This place feels happy now." The observation warmed Margaret more than the stove's heat. She'd noticed it too. How the cowboys lingered after meals talking and laughing instead of wolfing down food and escaping. How they'd started bringing her little gifts, a particularly nice chicken for the pot wild honey from a tree. They'd found a handful of pecans gathered on the range. "Mrs. Sullivan," Tom said, suddenly serious, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What do you know about Jake's past, before the Circle M?" Margaret paused in her work. Over the weeks, she'd gleaned fragments, an educated accent that slipped through when he was tired, the way he handled the account books with easy familiarity, his knowledge of things no simple rancher would know. But Jake Caldwell guarded his secrets as carefully as she'd once guarded her husband's reputation. Only what he's chosen to share. "Why do you ask?" "It's just, sometimes I catch him looking at you when you're singing while you work, or when you're laughing with the men. Like he's seeing a ghost, but not a bad one. A good memory he'd forgotten he had." Before Margaret could respond, the man himself appeared in the doorway. "Tom, if that arm's well enough for gossip, it's well enough for light work. The horses need tending." Tom scrambled up, flushing. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." After he left, Jake remained filling the doorframe in that way he had of making the kitchen seem smaller. "The boy talks too much." "He's young." Margaret focused on rolling out pie dough. "The young always talk too much." "Maybe." Jake moved into the kitchen, going to the stove to pour himself coffee. It was a new habit, these morning visits before the crew arrived. He never stayed long, but Margaret had come to treasure these moments of almost companionship. Though sometimes talking helps, keeps the silence from getting too heavy. "Is that what you think? That it's too quiet here?" She looked up then, meeting those gray eyes. "I think a man who asks for laughter with his meals might be tired of silence." "Yes." He studied his coffee for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so low, she had to strain to hear it. "My wife loved to sing while she cooked. Sarah. She'd been gone 2 years before I came here, but sometimes I still hear her voice in the wind." Margaret's hands stilled. Wife. He'd had a wife. What happened to her? "Cholera took her and our daughter both while I was away on business." His voice was flat. Matter of fact, his knuckles were white around the cup. "I was in Austin negotiating cattle prices. Thought I was building something important. Came home to 2 graves and a house that echoed." "Jake." He shook his head. "It's history now. But Tom's right. You've brought something back to this place, something I thought was gone for good." He set down his cup and moved toward the door, then paused. "There's going to be a dance in town next Saturday. The harvest dance. The men are all going." "How nice for them." Margaret returned to her pie heart, suddenly hammering. "You could come." The invitation hung in the air between them. "Mr. Caldwell, that would hardly be appropriate. I'm your employee. And you haven't left this ranch in 6 weeks. You need supplies from town anyway, don't you? Fabric for new curtains. Perhaps some proper dishes, since you're always complaining about the tin plates." She looked at him in surprise. She had mentioned those things, but only in passing. Usually to Tom or the other cowboys. She hadn't realized Jake paid attention to her casual comments. Yes, supplies would be helpful." "Then it's settled. We'll leave at noon on Saturday. You can shop while the men get cleaned up." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Then if you happen to stop by the dance hall, and if I happen to be there, and if the musicians happen to play something worth dancing to." Despite herself, Margaret smiled. "That's quite a lot of happenstance, Mr. Caldwell." "Jake," he said quietly. "In the evenings, when it's just conversation, call me Jake." He left before she could respond. Margaret found herself humming as she finished the pies. A dance. She hadn't danced since before Charles died. Her good dress was long gone, sold to pay creditors. But perhaps she could do something with one of her calico dresses. That evening, after the supper dishes were done, Margaret heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Jake holding a package wrapped in brown paper. "This was my mother's." He thrust the package at her without preamble. "It's been in a trunk for years. Might need altering, but—" He strode away before she could even thank him. Inside, Margaret found a dress of deep blue wool, simple but beautifully made. The kind of dress a rancher's wife would wear to church or to a dance. Nothing fancy by Philadelphia standards, but the fabric was quality, and the color would bring out her eyes. She held it up to herself, noting it would need taking in at the waist and hemming. But otherwise, it was perfect. She spent the next evenings altering the dress by lamplight, listening to the Cowboys practice their harmonicas and guitars on the bunkhouse porch. Jake had taken to sitting in the kitchen after dinner, working on his account books while she sewed. They rarely spoke, but the companionship was comfortable, like an old married couple sharing the evening hours. "You're good with a needle," he observed on Thursday night. Another useless Philadelphia accomplishment that turned out to be useful after all. Margaret bit off a thread. "Along with piano playing, watercolors, and the ability to make small talk with boring people." "None of those sound useless to me." He looked up from his ledger. "Especially the last one. You'll need it if Mrs. Henderson corners you at the dance. That woman could talk the ears off a donkey." Margaret laughed. "Duly warned. Any other social hazards I should know about?" "Well, there's Samuel Morrison. You've met him at the store. He's sweet on Widow Patterson, who runs the boarding house, but she pretends not to notice. Then there's the usual collection of young cowboys who'll want to dance with anything in skirts." He paused. "Oh, and avoid the punch. Charlie Benson always spikes it with rot-gut whiskey when no one's looking." "You sound like you actually enjoy these events." "I go because the men expect it. A boss who won't socialize with the community breeds resentment." He set down his pen. "But I usually leave early. Dancing alone gets old fast." The words hung between them. An unspoken invitation, or perhaps just a statement of fact. Margaret kept her eyes on her sewing. Well, if there happens to be dancing, and if partners happen to be scarce. More happenstance, Mrs. Sullivan. "Margaret," she said softly. "In the evenings when it's just conversation, call me Margaret." His smile transformed his face, years falling away to reveal the young man he must have been before loss hardened him. Saturday dawned clear and crisp. Margaret packed her pies carefully in the wagon she'd volunteered to contribute to the communal supper that preceded the dance. Jake appeared in his best clothes, dark trousers, white shirt, black vest, and a coat that showed city tailoring despite its age. He looked, she thought, with a flutter quite distinguished. The ride to town passed quickly. Jake pointed out landmarks, told stories of the ranch's early days, even laughed at her account of her first week's disasters. It was the most relaxed she'd ever seen him, as if leaving the ranch boundaries allowed him to leave some of his burdens behind. In town, Margaret shopped with careful attention to her small savings. New plates would have to wait, but she bought fabric for proper curtains, some spices the general store had finally gotten in stock, and an indulgence of indulgences, a small bottle of rose water. The dance hall was already crowded when they arrived. Margaret's pies disappeared quickly, earning her compliments from the ranch wives who'd previously eyed her with suspicion. "You're doing a fine job out there," Mrs. Morrison said, her tone slightly warmer than their first meeting. "The Circle M boys are looking well fed for the first time in years." "Thank you. I had a good teacher." Margaret held up the cookbook Jake had loaned her. "Old recipes, but reliable." "Is that Anna Caldwell's book?" An older woman peered at it with interest. "I knew her years ago. Lovely woman. Terrible shame what happened." Before Margaret could ask more, the musicians struck up a lively reel. Cowboys descended on the gathered women like bees to flowers. Margaret found herself swept onto the floor by an enthusiastic young rancher who who stepped on her feet more than the boards. She endured 2 dances before begging off, retreating to the refreshment table. Surviving the social warfare. She turned to find Jake beside her, amusement flickering in his eyes. He'd been dancing with Mrs. Henderson, who did indeed appear to have talked through the entire set. Barely. I'd forgotten how exhausting it is to pretend your feet aren't being murdered. Here. He handed her a cup. Lemonade from the safe pitcher. They stood together watching the dancers spin past. The musicians switched to a slower waltz, and Margaret felt Jake shift beside her. Would you... He cleared his throat. That is, if your feet have had time to recover. Are you asking me to dance, Jake? I'm suggesting that if you happen to be on the dance floor and I happen to be there as well. Enough happenstance. Margaret set down her cup. Yes, I'd like to dance. He led her onto the floor with a hand at her elbow, then turned to face her. One hand settled properly at her waist. The other took hers. And suddenly, Margaret understood why he'd been so careful with all his happenstances. This was dangerous. Not for propriety's sake, but for the way her heart accelerated when he pulled her into the dance. Jake Caldwell could waltz. Not the mechanical steps of a man who'd learned for duty's sake, but with the natural grace of someone who'd once enjoyed it. He guided her through the turns effortlessly, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the movement, trusting his lead. You dance well for a cowboy. You dance well for a cook. Then more seriously, I haven't waltzed since Sarah died. Didn't think I remembered how. It's like riding a horse, I suppose. The body remembers even when the heart forgets. His hand tightened slightly at her waist. Yes, exactly that. They danced 2 more waltzes, not speaking, just moving together, while the town watched and whispered. Margaret knew there would be talk, the widow and the rancher dancing like they had the right. But wrapped in the warmth of Jake's careful hold, she couldn't bring herself to care. Because for the first time since Charles died, since the creditors came, since she'd fled Philadelphia in shame and desperation, Margaret Sullivan felt something she'd thought was lost forever. She felt alive. The storm announced itself with a wall of black clouds that swallowed the horizon whole. Margaret stood at the kitchen window watching the prairie grass bend flat under the advancing wind. She'd lived through eastern storms, brief violent things that passed quickly. But this was something else entirely, something ancient and merciless that made humanity seem small and temporary. It's going to be a bad one. Tom appeared in the doorway, his healed arm held carefully out of old habit. Jake's got most of the men moving the cattle to the sheltered valley, but he didn't need to finish. Margaret had learned enough about ranch life to understand. Cattle scattered in a storm like this could wander for miles, die in flash floods, or simply vanish into the vast landscape. And the men searching for them faced the same dangers. How many are still out? 8, including Jake. Bill and Frank were riding the north pasture that's 15 miles out. They might not have seen the storm coming in time. Margaret turned from the window, her mind already calculating. How many staying here? Just me, old Pete, and Charlie. He's nursing a lame horse. Everyone else is out. Then we prepare. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. This kitchen stays warm and ready. Get Pete to help you fill every available container with water. If this storm's as bad as it looks, the well might flood. Charlie can bring in extra firewood. I'll start cooking. Tom grinned, despite the worry in his eyes. Yes, ma'am. You sound like a general. I was a doctor's wife, Tom. I've managed through disasters before. As the men scattered to their tasks, Margaret attacked her preparations with focused energy. She set beans to soak mixed dough for multiple loaves of bread, started a massive pot of stew that could feed 20 men if needed. Her hands moved automatically while her mind wandered to Jake somewhere out in that gathering darkness. The storm hit just after 3. The first fat raindrops turned within minutes to a deluge that hammered the roof like rifle fire. Wind screamed around the corners of the house, finding every crack and crevice. The kitchen, usually Margaret's warm sanctuary, felt suddenly fragile against nature's assault. Mary, Mother of God! Pete muttered, peering out at the wall of water. Ain't seen a storm like this in 10 years. Last one took the old barn and half the herd. Margaret lit every lantern they had, creating a beacon of warmth and light. The stew simmered. Bread baked. Coffee stayed hot and ready. She kept her hands busy to avoid thinking about men and horses struggling through mud and rising water. About the particular man who'd waltzed with her just a week ago and might now be, "Riders coming!" Charlie shouted from the porch. 4 cowboys stumbled through the door, soaked to the skin and shivering. Margaret immediately handed out towels and hot coffee while they stripped off sodden coats. "Jake." She tried to keep her voice steady. "Still out," one answered through chattering teeth. "He sent us back when the lightning started. Said he and Hank would keep looking for Bill and Frank." Margaret's heart clenched, but she kept her face calm. "Sit, eat. You need warmth and food." The hours crawled by. The storm, if anything, intensified. Water began seeping under the door, despite their efforts to block it. The wind found a loose board somewhere and worried it like a dog with a bone, the banging adding to the cacophony. 2 more groups of riders arrived, each time raising and dashing Margaret's hopes. Each group told the same story: Jake had sent them to safety, while he continued searching. The man stubborn as granite and twice as hard-headed, she thought furiously, ladling out more stew. By nightfall, she'd fed 13 men some twice, and still maintained her vigil. "He knows this land better than anyone," Tom said quietly, appearing at her elbow. "He'll find shelter." "Of course he will." Margaret's hand shook as she kneaded more bread, her 4th batch. The action was automatic now. Something to do while her mind painted terrible pictures. It was past midnight when Charlie's shout brought everyone alert. "Light! I see a light!" Men crowded to the windows and door. Through the rain, a lantern bobbed like a will-o'-the-wisp. Then another, and another. "Open the door!" someone yelled. "They're coming in!" The wind nearly tore the door from its hinges when they opened it. 4 figures stumbled through, Bill and Frank supported between Jake and Hank. All 4 were so covered in mud, they looked like creatures made of earth itself. "Blankets," Jake ordered, his voice rough but strong. "Hot water. Bill's got a gash on his leg." Margaret flew into action. Within minutes, she had the injured man on the table, his leg cleaned and examined. The cut was deep but clean. A branch or rock had caught him when his horse fell. She stitched it carefully, while Jake held the lantern, his own exhaustion evident in the way he swayed. "You need to sit," she told him firmly. "Tom, get your boss some coffee before he falls over." "I'm fine." But he sank onto the bench when Tom pushed him down. Margaret finished with Bill bandaging the wound tightly. "Keep it clean and dry. You were lucky. No damage to the muscle." "Lucky?" Frank laughed shakily. "Ma'am, we'd be dead if Jake hadn't found us. Couldn't see 5 feet in that rain. We'd taken shelter under some rocks, but the water was rising. Would have drowned for sure." "Enough talk." Margaret's voice came out sharper than she intended. "Everyone needs food and rest." The next hour was controlled chaos, as she fed exhausted men, distributed dry clothes from the rag bag, tried to create sleeping spaces for everyone. Through it all, she was aware of Jake watching her with a strange expression on his mud-streaked face. Finally, when the last cowboy was settled, she approached him. He sat alone at the table, coffee growing cold in his hands. "You should rest." "In a moment." He looked up at her, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "You did well tonight. This kitchen, it was exactly what the men needed. A safe harbor." "It's just food and warmth, Jake. Nothing special." "No." His voice was firm. "It's more than that. Sarah used to do this, turn the kitchen into the heart of things when trouble came. I'd forgotten how much it matters. Having someone who just handles things, who makes sure there's light in the darkness." Margaret's throat tightened. "Anyone would have." "No," he interrupted. "They wouldn't. The last 3 cooks hid in their rooms during storms. You turned this into a field hospital and refuge center without anyone asking." He stood swaying slightly. "Thank you, Margaret." The use of her given name here in the kitchen with his men sleeping all around felt dangerously intimate. You should thank me by getting some rest before you fall over. Heroes who collapse from exhaustion are very inconvenient. A smile ghosted across his face. I'm no hero, just a stubborn fool who couldn't leave his men behind. Same thing in my book. She steered him toward the door. Go sleep. I'll keep watch and wake you if anything changes. He paused at the door, looking back. Margaret, at the dance, when we bed Jake, we can talk about dancing when you're not dead on your feet. After he left, Margaret surveyed her kingdom. The kitchen was a disaster, muddy boot prints everywhere, dishes piled high, wet clothes dripping from every available surface. But it was warm and full of life, with snoring cowboys and the smell of bread and coffee, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere, despite the storm still raging outside. She made herself tea and settled into the chair by the stove. Someone should keep the fire going. Make sure there was hot food when the men woke. It wasn't heroic work, not like riding into a storm to save lost cowboys. But it was necessary work. And more than that, it was satisfying in a bone-deep way she'd never experienced in her Philadelphia life. The storm began to ease around dawn, its fury spent. Pale light crept through the windows, revealing a landscape transformed by water and wind. But the Circle M had survived, all souls accounted for, and Margaret's kitchen had played its part in that survival. Jake found her there, as the sun broke through the clouds, still in her chair, but awake, fresh coffee already brewing. Did you sleep at all? Did you? They looked at each other across the kitchen, the stern rancher and the Philadelphia widow, both exhausted, both exactly where they needed to be, and smiled. I'll make breakfast, she said, rising. You wake the men. And Jake. Next time you decide to be heroic, try to do it before midnight. These late nights are terrible for my complexion. His laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine, followed her to the stove. The days following the storm passed in a blur of recovery. Fences needed mending, scattered cattle required gathering, the damaged barn roof demanded immediate attention. Margaret barely saw Jake except at meals where he ate quickly and spoke only of ranch business. But she felt his eyes on her sometimes. A weight of unspoken words that made her hands unsteady as she served. It was Tom who finally voiced what everyone seemed to be thinking. You two are dancing around each other worse than green colts, he said one afternoon, helping her peel potatoes. His arm had healed fully, but he still found excuses to visit the kitchen. I don't know what you mean. Heat rose in her cheeks. Sure you don't. And Jake doesn't spend half his time staring at the kitchen window when he thinks no one's looking. Before Margaret could respond, they heard horses approaching fast, too fast for normal ranch business. Through the window, she saw Jake and Hank riding hard toward the house, something wrapped in blankets across Hank's saddle. Get water boiling, Jake shouted before they'd even reached the yard. And clean cloths. Margaret's heart lurched. She'd heard that tone before in Charles's voice when emergency cases arrived. By the time the men burst through the door, she had water heating and her makeshift medical supplies laid out. They carried young Will Morrison, the storekeeper's nephew, barely 16, and working his first season as a cowboy. His face was white as parchment, his breathing shallow and rapid. Blood soaked through the blanket around his middle. Gored by a bull, Jake said tersely as they laid him on the table. It's bad, Margaret. She peeled back the blanket and had to suppress a gasp. The wound was deep, ragged, still bleeding freely. In Philadelphia, Charles would have had proper instruments, chloroform, a sterile operating room. Here she had kitchen knives, whiskey, and desperate hope. I need more light. All the lanterns you can find. Tom, get my sewing basket, the one with the silk thread. Hank, I need the whiskey from Jake's office, the good bottle. Margaret. Jake's voice was quiet, uncertain. If it's too much, it's not too much. She met his eyes firmly. But I need everyone to do exactly as I say. This is beyond basic field medicine. For the next 2 hours, Margaret worked with focused intensity that would have impressed her late husband. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, stitched internal damage with silk thread, boiled in water, packed the area with clean cloth soaked in honey. an old remedy her grandmother had sworn by. Through it all, Jake stood at the boy's head, holding him still, speaking in a low, calm voice, when Will stirred toward consciousness. "You're doing fine, son. Mrs. Sullivan's got the best hands in Montana. You'll be dancing at the Christmas social, just wait and see." Margaret's hands moved with remembered skill, making tiny, careful stitches. She was dimly aware of other cowboys gathering in the kitchen of Tom, keeping coffee hot of the afternoon sun, slanting through her cheerful curtains, onto this desperate scene. Finally, she tied off the last stitch and stepped back. Will's breathing was stronger, his color marginally better. But she knew the real danger was still to come. Infection fever complications she couldn't predict or prevent. He needs to stay absolutely still for at least a week. The stitches could tear if he moves, and someone needs to watch him constantly. If fever sets in, we'll take shifts, Jake said immediately. Whatever he needs. They moved Will carefully to Margaret's own bed. It was closest to the kitchen and its warmth. She insisted despite Jake's protests. "I can sleep on the kitchen settle. He needs the comfort more than I do." That night, sitting beside Will's bed, monitoring his breathing and temperature, Margaret found herself speaking to Jake in the dim lamplight. He'd taken the first watch with her, refusing to leave. "You were remarkable today." His voice was soft. "I've seen field surgeons with less skill." "I was terrified," she admitted. "In Philadelphia, I only assisted. Charles made the decisions, held the responsibility. Today," she gestured helplessly, "today I saved a boy's life. Maybe, if infection doesn't set in. If the stitches hold. If a dozen other things don't go wrong." She checked Will's forehead again. Still cool. Thank God. "I used to think Charles was weak for turning to laudanum. But carrying this weight, knowing someone's life depends on your choices. I understand better now." Jake shifted in his chair, the lamplight casting shadows across his face. "After Sarah died, I swore I'd never be responsible for another person's life that way. Cattle, yes. Ranch hands who knew the risks fine. But not—" He paused. "Then you arrived." Margaret's breath caught. "Jake, let me finish. Please." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, not quite meeting her eyes. "That first day I told myself you were just another employee. Keep it businesslike, distant, safe. But then you burned those biscuits and swore like a sailor. And you set Tom's arm without flinching. And you turned my kitchen into something alive again. It's just cooking and basic medicine. No, it's hope. It's caring whether these men have pie after dinner, or flowers on the table, or someone to stitch them up when they're bleeding." He finally looked at her. "It's making me remember why I wanted to build something here in the first place." Will stirred, mumbling something incoherent. Margaret quickly checked him. Still no fever wounds, still closed. When she settled back, Jake had composed himself again. The moment of raw honesty shuddered. "You should rest. I'll wake you if anything changes." "In a while." He pulled out a worn book. "I'll read for a bit. Sarah always said reading aloud helped the healing." He opened the book, poetry she realized with surprise, and began to read in his low, measured voice. Wordsworth speaking of daffodils and clouds and the human heart. Margaret found herself watching Jake's face in the lamplight, seeing the gentleness he kept so carefully hidden, the depth of feeling beneath the stern exterior. 3 days passed in careful vigilance. Will's fever rose the second night, sending them all into controlled panic. Margaret bathed him with cool water, spooned willow bark tea between his lips, and prayed harder than she had since Charles's death. Jake never left her side during those critical hours. Fetching water, changing bandages, simply being present when she needed steadiness. When the fever broke near dawn, they both sagged with relief. Will opened clear eyes and whispered, "Ma'am, did I miss breakfast?" Margaret laughed through sudden tears. "Several of them, but I'll make you the finest breakfast in Montana when you're stronger." Later, standing on the porch in the cool morning air, she found herself swaying with exhaustion. Jake's hands steadied her, and somehow she was leaning against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. "You did it," he murmured into her hair. "You brought him through." "We did it. I couldn't have managed without you." She felt him smile. "We make a good team." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Margaret knew she should step away, return to proper distance. Instead, she let herself rest against him for one more moment, storing up the feeling for later examination. "Margaret." His voice was quiet. "Careful. When this is over, when Will's recovered, we need to talk. Really talk. About the future. About whether you see this as just a job, or if maybe it could be something more." Before she could respond, Tom's voice called from inside. "Mrs. Sullivan, Will's asking for more of that tea." The moment shattered. Margaret stepped back, smoothing her apron, not quite meeting Jake's eyes. "I should go." "Of course." But he caught her hand as she turned. "Just think about it, please." She squeezed his fingers briefly. "I've been thinking about it for weeks, Jake. Now let me tend my patient." His smile followed her back into the kitchen, warming her more than the stove. Will recovered with the resilience of youth. Within days, he was sitting up complaining about being confined to bed with an energy that spoke of healing. His uncle came from town, overwhelmed with gratitude, pressing payment on Margaret that she refused to accept. "You saved my nephew's life. There must be something I can do. Keep bringing those good supplies to the ranch, Mr. Morrison. That's payment enough." As Will grew stronger, Margaret found herself growing more uncertain. The conversation with Jake hung unfinished between them. He still came for coffee in the mornings, still worked on ledgers, while she sewed in the evenings. But there was a careful distance now, as if he too was waiting for something. One week after Will's injury, Jake found her in the kitchen late at night. She was kneading bread dough, always her response to nervous energy, while the house slept around them. "Can't sleep." She startled, then resumed kneading. "Too much on my mind." "Margaret." He came to stand beside her at the table, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "We need to finish that conversation." "Do we?" "You know we do." His hand covered hers, stilling the restless motion. "I've been patient, given you time. But I need to know, is this just a job to you? Because for me, it stopped being that weeks ago." Margaret's heart hammered. She looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused from hard work, hers flour-dusted and still marked by the softness of her former life. "I was married to a man who hid things from me, who made decisions without my knowledge, who died and left me with nothing but debts and shame." Her voice came out steady despite the trembling inside. "I swore I'd never put myself in that position again." "I'm not Charles." "No, you're not." She looked up at him finally. "You're honest, direct. You've never hidden what you think or feel. And that terrifies me more than anything." "Why?" "Because when you're honest, I have to be honest too. And the truth is—" She drew a shaky breath. "The truth is, I love you, Jake Caldwell. I love this ranch and these men and this kitchen that you trusted me with. I love the way you read poetry when you think no one's listening, and how you remember small things people say, and the way you risk your life for your cowboys without hesitation." Her voice broke. "I love you, and it terrifies me because loving you means risking everything again. And I don't know if I'm brave enough for that." Jake was silent for a long moment. Then he lifted her flour-covered hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Margaret Sullivan, you're the bravest woman I've ever met. You came 800 miles with nothing but hope. You learned to cook on a stove that defeated 3 women before you. You set broken bones and saved a dying boy and turned a house of silence into a home full of laughter." He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "And you're standing here telling me you're not brave enough. That's horseshit, and we both know it." Despite everything, she laughed. "Language, Mr. Caldwell. Marry me." The words came out fierce, urgent. "Not because you need shelter or wages or a place to belong. Marry me because we make each other better. Because this kitchen comes alive when you're in it. Because I'm tired of pretending my heart didn't come back to life the day you arrived." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm 43 years old, set in my ways. I'll never be a young bride in white. I don't want a young bride in white. I want you. Flower in your hair and stubborn as hell and brave enough to love again despite everything that tried to break you." He kissed her, then tasting of coffee and hope and second chances. When they finally parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "Is that a yes?" Margaret smiled through her tears. "That's a yes, Jake Caldwell. Though you realize this means I'll be cooking my own wedding dinner. I'll help. We'll make it together. Together." She tested the word, found it settling around her like a warm shawl. "I like the sound of that." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the prairie white and clean. Inside, in the kitchen that had witnessed so much transformation, two people who'd thought love was behind them stood wrapped in each other's arms, planning a future neither had dared to hope for. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Margaret woke in her small room the last time she'd wake here as simply the cook and lay listening to the ranch stirring to life. In 3 weeks, she'd marry Jake Caldwell on Christmas Day. The thought sent equal parts joy and terror through her chest. She dressed quickly and headed to the kitchen, stopping short at the doorway. Jake stood at the stove managing the fire with practiced ease. Coffee was already brewing. Biscuit dough sat ready on the counter. "You're up early." He turned, and the smile that crossed his weathered face made her heart skip. "Figured you could use help. Besides, if I'm going to marry the cook, I should probably learn to actually cook." "You already know how." "Then I should practice. Can't have the boss's wife doing all the work while he sits idle." He gestured to the dough. "Show me how you want these cut." They worked side by side in comfortable silence, their movements already synchronized from weeks of those morning coffee visits. When Tom arrived for his usual early appearance, he stopped in the doorway with a knowing grin. "Well, it's about damn time." "Language, Tom." But Margaret couldn't help smiling. "The boys are going to lose their minds. We've been waiting weeks for Jake to stop being stubborn." Tom helped himself to coffee. "There's already a betting pool on when he'd propose. I won, by the way. Said it'd be after someone nearly died and you saved them. You bet on our engagement." Jake's voice held more amusement than anger. "Yes, sir. Made $15 too." Tom's grin widened. "Worth every penny of patience watching you two dance around each other like scared rabbits." Margaret threw a dish towel at him, which he dodged easily. The news spread through the ranch like wildfire. By breakfast, every cowboy knew, and the kitchen filled with congratulations and good-natured ribbing. Will Morrison, now recovered enough to sit at the table, raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To Mrs. Sullivan, who saved my life and is brave enough to marry the boss. That takes real courage, ma'am." "More courage than getting gored by a bull?" Margaret asked dryly. "Way more. At least the bull was honest about wanting to kill me." Even Jake laughed at that. But as the days passed and Christmas approached, Margaret found herself wrestling with unexpected doubts. Not about Jake, never about Jake, but about herself. She was measuring flour for bread one afternoon when Mrs. Henderson arrived unannounced, driving her own wagon through the December cold. Mrs. Sullivan, or should I say soon-to-be Mrs. Caldwell. Margaret wiped flour from her hands and invited the woman in her heart, sinking. Mrs. Henderson was the town's biggest gossip, and her unexpected visit couldn't mean anything good. "I won't take much of your time, dear. Just wanted to bring this." She produced a package wrapped in brown paper. "My own wedding veil. Thought you might want to borrow it, seeing as you came west without much in the way of finery." The kindness caught Margaret off guard. "That's very generous, Mrs. Henderson." "Well, we women have to stick together out here." She settled at the table, clearly prepared to stay a while. "Of course, there's been quite a bit of talk in town about the wedding." There it was. "What kind of talk?" Oh, nothing terrible. Just questions you understand. About the speed of things. You've only been here 3 months. And Jake, well, he loved Sarah something fierce. Some folks are wondering if he's really ready to marry again, or if he's just lonely and you're convenient. The words hit like a slap, even though Margaret had thought them herself in dark moments. I see. Now I don't hold with that kind of gossip myself. Mrs. Henderson's voice turned brisk. Anyone with eyes can see Jake looks at you like you hung the moon. And you've been good for the ranch, good for the men. But you should know what you're walking into. Small-town talk can be cruel. After she left, Margaret stood at the window, staring out at the snow-covered prairie. Was she just convenient? A solution to Jake's loneliness and the ranch's need for a cook? You're thinking too loud. She turned to find Jake in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. Mrs. Henderson came by. Ah. He hung up his coat. What delightful poison did she deliver? Nothing I haven't thought myself. Margaret's hands twisted in her apron. Jake, are you sure about this? About me? It's only been 3 months. Maybe we should wait. Give it more time. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her face in his hands. Margaret Sullivan, look at me. She met his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had been so cold when she'd first arrived and now burned with something that made her knees weak. I loved Sarah. I won't lie about that or pretend otherwise. She was my first love, and losing her nearly destroyed me. His thumbs brushed away tears Margaret hadn't realized were falling. But you're not Sarah. You're not a replacement, or a convenience, or a way to fill empty space. Then what am I? You're the woman who makes me want to wake up in the morning, who turned a house into a home without even trying, who's brave and stubborn and scared as hell but shows up anyway. His voice went rough. You're my second chance, Margaret, and I'll be damned if I let small-town gossip make you doubt that. What if I'm not enough? What if... He kissed her, cutting off the spiral of fear. You're more than enough. You're everything. That night, Jake insisted she join him in the main house, properly chaperoned with Tom sleeping on the porch, despite the cold, to discuss wedding plans. It'll be small, Margaret said, grateful for the practical discussion. Just the ranch hands and a few folks from town. About that, Jake pulled out a letter from his desk. I wrote to my sister in Texas. Haven't seen her in 5 years, but I thought she's family. She should know I'm getting married. Margaret's throat tightened. You have a sister. Catherine. She's younger by 6 years, married to a banker in San Antonio. We had a falling out after Sarah died. She wanted me to come home. Couldn't understand why I needed to stay away. He stared at the letter. But she's still my sister, and you're going to be my wife. It's time to mend fences. Did you tell her about me? Told her you're a Philadelphia widow who came west for work and ended up stealing my heart. His smile was soft. Told her you're stubborn and brave and terrible at biscuits when you started, but getting better every day. You told your sister I was terrible at biscuits. Had to be honest. Catherine would see right through anything less. He handed her the letter. You should read it before I send it. The letter was simple and direct, pure Jake. But what struck Margaret was the vulnerability in it, the admission that he'd been wrong to push his family away, the hope that Catherine would come for the wedding, even though it was short notice. It's perfect. She folded it carefully. Send it. Even if she doesn't come, even then, you're reaching out. That's what matters. 2 weeks before the wedding disaster struck again. Margaret was checking on the bread when Jake burst through the door, his face grim. Tom's been thrown. Horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and went down hard. Tom's leg is broken bad. I need you. Her heart lurched, but her hands stayed steady as she grabbed her medical supplies. They'd moved Tom to the bunkhouse where he lay white-faced and sweating, his leg bent at an impossible angle. Everyone out except Jake. She ordered, her voice calm, despite the fear clawing at her chest. This wasn't a simple fracture like the arm had been. This was serious. She examined the leg, carefully feeling Tom's pulse racing under her fingers. The bone was broken in at least 2 places, and there might be internal damage she couldn't see. Tom, listen to me. This is going to hurt worse than anything you've ever felt. But if I don't set it now properly, you could lose the leg. Then do it, ma'am. His voice trembled. I trust you. Those 3 words nearly broke her. Jake positioned himself at Tom's head, ready to hold him down. Margaret took a deep breath, said a prayer, and pulled. Tom's scream echoed across the ranch. But when she was done, the leg was straight, the bones aligned as best she could manage. She splinted it carefully, padding it with torn sheets. He'll need to stay off it for at least 8 weeks, maybe longer. She pressed a cloth soaked in willow bark tea to Tom's lips. And he needs to be watched constantly for fever or infection. I'll watch him. Jake's voice was rough. You've done enough. But Margaret shook her head. We'll take shifts, all of us. He saved me from burning down the kitchen my 2nd day. Now we save him. For the next 3 days, she barely slept. Between cooking for the ranch, monitoring Will's continued recovery, and checking Tom every few hours, she was running on coffee and determination. Jake tried to make her rest, but she refused. I can't stop, Jake. If I stop, I'll think about all the ways this could go wrong, all the things I might have missed. Margaret. He caught her as she swayed with exhaustion. You're going to collapse. I'm fine. No, you're not. And Tom wouldn't want you killing yourself to save him. I'm not killing myself. I'm just... You're terrified. His voice went soft. Because you care about these men. Because this place has become home, and these cowboys have become family, and the thought of losing any of them tears you apart. She sagged against him, finally admitting what she'd been fighting. What if I'm not good enough, Jake? What if Tom dies because I missed something? What if... Then we'll face it together. But you can't carry this alone. He guided her to a chair. I'm putting Pete in charge of the kitchen for tonight. You're going to sleep. Real sleep in a real bed for 8 hours minimum. But Tom... We'll be fine for 1 night. I'll watch him myself. When she started to protest, he pressed a finger to her lips. Margaret, you can't pour from an empty cup. Let me take care of things. Let me take care of you. She wanted to argue, but exhaustion won. She let him lead her to the small room off the kitchen, let him remove her boots, and cover her with a quilt. Sleep, love. I've got everything. She woke 12 hours later to find Jake sitting beside the bed watching her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. Tom. Fever-free, complaining about the food Pete's been serving, which means he's on the mend. Jake brushed hair from her face. You did it again. Saved another life. We did it. I couldn't manage without you. Team, remember. He pulled her up gently. Now come eat something. Pete's threatened to quit if you don't come rescue the kitchen from his attempts at breakfast. Life settled into a new rhythm, Tom recovering slowly but surely. Will back to light duties. The wedding approaching with terrifying speed. Margaret found herself in her room one evening staring at the blue wool dress Jake's mother had worn. She'd altered it carefully, and it fit perfectly now. But doubts crept in like winter cold through cracks. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Come in. Jake entered, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Brought you something. Early wedding gift. Inside was a music box intricately carved with wildflowers. When she opened it, a soft melody filled the room, a waltz she recognized from the harvest dance. Jake, this is beautiful. Ordered it from a catalog months ago, before I even knew I was going to propose. He looked almost embarrassed. Saw it and thought of you. How you brought music back to this place. Margaret wound it again, listening to the delicate tune. I'm scared, Jake. Of what? Of being a wife again. Of making the same mistakes. Of not being enough. The confession tumbled out. Charles needed someone strong, and I failed him. What if I fail you too? Jake took the music box and set it aside, then pulled her to stand. Dance with me. What? Dance with me. Right here. No music except this. He began humming the waltz, guiding her into the familiar steps. They moved together in the small room, and gradually Margaret felt her fear loosening its grip. You didn't fail Charles, Jake said quietly as they danced. He failed himself, and you're not responsible for his choices any more than I'm responsible for Sarah's death. He pulled her closer. We both carry guilt we shouldn't, but maybe it's time to set it down. How? By choosing to be happy, by believing we deserve this. He stopped dancing, his hands framing her face. Margaret, you're not failing me. You're saving me. Every single day. She kissed him, then pouring everything she couldn't say into that kiss. Love and fear and hope and gratitude all tangled together. When they parted, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. 3 more weeks. Then you're mine, and I'm yours, and nobody can say otherwise. 3 weeks, she echoed. Jake, what if your sister doesn't come? What if? Then we marry anyway. But I have a feeling Catherine will surprise us. His faith proved justified. 2 weeks before Christmas, a telegram arrived from San Antonio. Arriving December 22nd. Stop. About time you came to your senses. Stop. Cannot wait to meet her. Stop. Catherine. Jake read it 3 times before he could speak. She's coming. Your sister's coming to the wedding. She's coming. He looked stunned, pleased, terrified, all at once. Margaret, I haven't seen her in 5 years. What if she loves you and is happy you're happy? Margaret took the telegram. What if this is the beginning of healing old wounds? You're not worried about meeting her. Terrified, but I'll face it. We'll face it together. Jake pulled her close, and Margaret let herself believe, truly believe, that everything might actually work out. The kitchen filled with the scent of baking as Christmas approached. Margaret threw herself into preparations, making every recipe in Jake's mother's cookbook. The Cowboys caught her Christmas spirit, decorating the main house with pine boughs and attempting to sing carols with varying degrees of success. Tom, still confined to bed, but healing well, became her chief taster. This one needs more cinnamon, he'd say, or, perfect, don't change a thing. You're enjoying this too much, Margaret told him, bringing another tray of cookies. Ma'am, I'm an injured man forced to stay in bed during the busiest time of year. Let me have my cookies and my opinions. She laughed and left him with a full plate. That night, Jake found her in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. She was working on her wedding cake, a simple affair, but she wanted it perfect. Can't sleep. Too excited. Too nervous. Too... She gestured at the cake. This has to be right, Jake. Everything has to be right. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. It's already right. You're here. I'm here. In 3 days we'll be married. Everything else is just decoration. Margaret leaned back against him, letting his solid warmth chase away the butterflies in her stomach. Your sister arrives tomorrow. I know. What if she doesn't like me? Impossible. You're impossible not to like. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Besides, Catherine's going to love you. How could she not? You made her stubborn brother remember how to live again. You give me too much credit. I give you exactly the credit you deserve. He turned her in his arms. Margaret Sullivan, you're the best thing that's ever happened to this ranch, to these men, to me, and in 3 days, the whole world will know you're mine. Yours? She whispered. I like the sound of that. Good, because I'm never letting you go. They stood there in the warm kitchen holding each other while the wedding cake cooled and the ranch slept around them. 3 days until Christmas. 3 days until their wedding. 3 days until Margaret Sullivan became Margaret Caldwell and started the life she'd never dared dream of when she'd stepped off that stagecoach 4 months ago. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Inside, two people who'd been broken by loss held each other and believed in the possibility of being whole again. And in the morning, Catherine Caldwell would arrive, bringing with her the final piece of Jake's past that needed healing. But tonight was theirs. Just the two of them, the warm kitchen, and the future spreading before them like fresh snow waiting for their first footprints. Catherine Caldwell arrived on the afternoon stage like a force of nature wrapped in expensive traveling clothes. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Jake helped his sister down from the coach. Their reunion awkward at first, 5 years of silence standing between them like a wall. Then Catherine threw her arms around her brother's neck and Jake held her tight, his shoulders shaking with emotion he'd kept buried for half a decade. Margaret's hands twisted in her apron. This elegant woman with her fashionable hat and confident bearing was everything Margaret had once been in Philadelphia: refined, educated, comfortable in her place in society. What would she think of her brother marrying a desperate widow who'd arrived with nothing but debts and determination? Stop that! Tom's voice came from his bed in the corner, where he'd been moved so Margaret could keep an eye on him. You're catastrophizing again. I don't know what you mean. You're thinking she's going to take one look at you and tell Jake he's making a mistake. Tom shifted his splinted leg carefully. But you're wrong. That woman traveled 1,000 miles in December to get here. That's not someone who's coming to cause problems. Before Margaret could respond, the door opened and Jake entered with Catherine on his arm. Up close, Catherine was younger than Margaret expected, perhaps 35, with Jake's gray eyes, but softer features. She took in the kitchen with one sweeping glance: the checkered curtains, the herbs hanging from the rafters, the warm glow of the stove, and smiled. So, this is where the magic happens. She turned to Margaret. You must be Margaret. Jake's letters didn't do you justice. Letters? Margaret shot Jake a look. You wrote more than once. 4 times. Catherine moved forward and took Margaret's flour-dusted hands in her own gloved ones, each one longer than the last. First letter was all facts. Hired a new cook, she's capable. Second letter, he mentioned you made the men laugh. Third letter, I knew he was falling in love, even if he hadn't admitted it yet. What gave it away? Margaret asked, her nervousness easing slightly. He wrote 3 pages about how you set a cowboy's broken arm without flinching. My brother doesn't write 3 pages about anything, unless it matters deeply. Catherine's smile turned mischievous. The 4th letter was just 2 lines: I'm getting married on Christmas Day. Please come. I need my family there. Jake cleared his throat, color rising in his weathered cheeks. Catherine, you're embarrassing me. Good. Someone needs to. She released Margaret's hands and looked around the kitchen again. This feels like Mama's kitchen used to feel. Warm, lived in, full of love. Her voice caught. Thank you for giving that back to him. Margaret's eyes burned with sudden tears. He gave me more than I gave him. Then you're perfect for each other. Catherine removed her gloves and hat. Now I'm told there's a wedding in 2 days, and I'm to be the matron of honor. Put me to work. What needs doing? The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and revelation. Catherine proved to be a whirlwind of efficient energy. She took over some of the cooking, insisted Margaret rest and focus on being a bride, and charmed every cowboy on the ranch within hours of arrival. But it was the evenings Margaret treasured most, sitting with Catherine and Jake after dinner, listening to stories about their childhood in Texas. Mama taught Jake to cook because she said a man who couldn't feed himself was useless, Catherine said, laughing at her brother's expression. He used to sneak into the kitchen at night and practice biscuits until he got them right. That explains why you knew exactly what I was doing wrong, Margaret said. Mama's ghost would haunt me if I let someone struggle with her stove. Jake's voice was light, but his eyes held old pain. Catherine reached across the table and squeezed his hand. She'd be so proud of you, Jake, of what you've built here, of the man you've become despite... She stopped, glancing at Margaret. despite everything. You can say it, Jake said quietly. Margaret knows about the Comanche raid, about Mama and Papa. I'm so sorry, Margaret said. I can't imagine. No one can unless they've lived it. Catherine's voice went hard. I was at finishing school in New Orleans when it happened. Safe, protected, while Jake came home to... She shook her head. I blamed him for years. Told him if he'd been there he could have saved them. It was cruel and unfair, and I've regretted it every day since. You were grieving, Jake said. We both were. We said things we didn't mean. But I drove you away. Made you feel like you had to leave Texas entirely to escape the guilt. Catherine's eyes filled. And then you lost Sarah and Emma, and I wasn't there for you because I'd been too stubborn to apologize. You're here now, Margaret said gently. That's what matters. Catherine wiped her eyes. Jake chose well. You're exactly what he needs, someone who understands loss, but doesn't let it define everything. That night, as Margaret lay in her small room for the last time, she heard voices outside her door. Jake and Catherine talking low. She's wonderful, Jake. Truly. I know. And you love her. More than I thought possible. Jake's voice was soft. Wondering. After Sarah died, I thought that part of me died too. But Margaret, she didn't fix me, Catherine. She just made me want to be whole again. That's what love should do. A pause. Mama would have liked her. Would have loved how she's made this kitchen live again. Do you think... Jake's voice cracked. Do you think Sarah would have approved? I feel like I'm betraying her memory sometimes. Moving on. Being happy. Sarah loved you enough to want you to be happy even without her. Catherine's voice was firm. She wouldn't want you spending your life alone, Jake. She'd want exactly this, a good woman, a warm home, a second chance at joy. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't realized Jake still carried guilt about loving again. Hadn't known he feared betraying Sarah's memory. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold. The ranch buzzed with preparation. Cowboys cleaned the main house until it sparkled. Tom, still in his splint, but determined to attend the wedding, directed operations from a chair. Will Morrison arrived from town with his uncle, bringing news that half the town planned to come despite the short notice. Can't have the Circle M's wedding without proper celebration, Samuel Morrison said, unloading a wagon full of supplies. Mrs. Henderson organized the church ladies. They're bringing enough food to feed an army. Margaret stood in the kitchen, overwhelmed. I didn't expect. You saved my nephew's life, Mrs. Sullivan, and Tom's leg, and probably half a dozen other folks with your medicines and your capable hands. Morrison's voice was gruff with emotion. This town takes care of its own, and you're one of us now. Catherine found Margaret that afternoon sitting in her room staring at the blue wool dress. Having second thoughts. Third and fourth thoughts. Margaret looked up. Catherine, what if I'm not enough? What if Jake wakes up one day and realizes he made a mistake? Catherine sat beside her on the narrow bed. Can I tell you something about my brother? Please. Jake doesn't do anything halfway. When he loved Sarah, he loved her with everything he had. When she died, he grieved with that same intensity. He doesn't know how to be casual or uncertain about important things. She took Margaret's hand. So if he asked you to marry him, if he looks at you the way he's been looking at you since I arrived, like you're the answer to prayers he didn't know he was praying, then he's certain. Completely, utterly certain. But what if I fail him? What if you don't? Catherine's voice was gentle. Margaret, you came 800 miles with nothing. You learned skills you didn't have. You saved lives. You turned a house full of lonely men into a family. You've already proven you don't give up when things get hard. Why would marriage be any different? Because it's marriage. Because I failed at it once before. No, your husband failed at it. There's a difference. Catherine squeezed her hand. You were dealt a terrible hand, Margaret, and you played it the best you could. But this time, This time, you've got a partner who will play fair, who will be honest even when it's hard, who will love you through the failures and the triumphs alike." Margaret drew a shaky breath. "You really think so?" "I know so, because that's who Jake is, and from what I've seen, that's who you are too." Catherine stood and pulled Margaret up with her. "Now come on. Let's get you ready to marry my stubborn brother and make this family complete again." Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow and brilliant sunshine. Margaret woke early, her stomach a tangle of nerves and excitement. Catherine appeared with coffee and calm efficiency. "No breakfast. Brides don't eat until after the ceremony. It's bad luck." "That's not true." "It is now. Drink your coffee and let me fix your hair." Margaret submitted to Catherine's ministrations, feeling more cherished than she had in years. The blue wool dress fit perfectly. Catherine's borrowed veil was simple but elegant. And when Margaret looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Not the desperate widow who'd arrived in October, but someone new, someone hopeful. "You're beautiful," Catherine said softly. "Jake's going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." A knock at the door interrupted them. Tom's voice came through the wood. "Mrs. Sullivan, Jake sent me to ask if you're ready. The Reverend's here and the whole territory's gathered in the main house." Margaret's heart hammered. Tell him yes. I'm ready." Catherine helped her to the door, then paused. "One more thing. Jake wanted me to give you this." She handed Margaret a small wooden box. Inside was a ring, simple gold, with a small diamond that caught the light. And a note in Jake's careful handwriting. "This was my grandmother's. She wore it for 50 years of marriage through droughts and plenty sickness and health hard times and good. She told me once that the secret to a long marriage was choosing each other every single day, even on the days when choosing was hard. I choose you, Margaret. Today and every day after. Love, Jake." Margaret's hands shook as she slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The walk to the main house felt both endless and too short. Cowboys lined the path, their hats off despite the cold faces split with grins. When she entered the house packed with ranch hands and townspeople and more flowers than she'd seen since leaving Philadelphia, Margaret's breath caught. But then she saw Jake. He stood at the far end of the room in a new suit, his hair slicked back, his face clean-shaven. But it was his eyes that undid her. Those storm-gray eyes that had been so cold 4 months ago now burned with love and promise and absolute certainty. Tom, standing beside him with a crutch for support, grinned. "Boss looks like he might pass out. Better hurry, ma'am." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Catherine took Margaret's arm and walked her forward. When they reached Jake, she placed Margaret's hand in her brother's and whispered, "Take care of each other." "Always," Jake said, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. The Reverend began the ceremony, but Margaret barely heard the words. She was too focused on Jake's hands holding hers, rough and calloused and steady. On the way, he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. On the feeling of absolute rightness settling into her bones. "Do you, Jacob Samuel Caldwell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was strong, clear, no hesitation. "And do you, Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Margaret looked at Jake, this wounded, wonderful man who'd given her not just shelter, but home, not just work, but purpose, not just kindness, but love. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the Montana Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride." Jake's hands framed her face gently, as if she was something precious. "Hello, Mrs. Caldwell." "Hello, Mr. Caldwell." He kissed her, then soft and sweet, and full of promise. When they parted, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Cowboys whistled. Catherine cried. Tom shouted something about winning another bet. The rest of the day passed in a joyful blur. The feast Mrs. Henderson and the church ladies had prepared. the toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. The dancing in the cleared main room, where Jake waltzed Margaret around while the Cowboys played fiddles and harmonicas with enthusiasm, if not always skill. As evening fell and guests began departing, Margaret found herself on the porch with Catherine watching the sun set over the snow-covered prairie. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said. "It meant everything to Jake, to both of us." "Thank you for giving me my brother back." Catherine's voice was thick with emotion. "He was lost for so long. But you found him." "He found me first." "Then you found each other. That's even better." She squeezed Margaret's hand. "I'm leaving tomorrow, but I'll be back in the spring. This ranch, this family, I want to be part of it again." "You are part of it. Always." After Catherine went inside, Jake appeared wrapping a blanket around Margaret's shoulders. "Cold out here, Mrs. Caldwell." "Mrs. Caldwell." She tested the name, found she loved it. "I'm not sure I'll ever get used to that." "You've got the rest of your life to practice." He pulled her close. "No regrets. Not a single one. Only that I didn't hire you sooner." His arms tightened around her. "Margaret, I know I'm not easy. I know this life is hard, but I promise you, no." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "No promises about being perfect or never struggling. That's not real life. Just promise me we'll face things together, that we'll choose each other even on the hard days." "Every day," he said fiercely. "Hard or easy, good or bad, I choose you every single day." She kissed him, then tasting coffee and wedding cake and the future they'd build together. When they parted, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Come on, let's go home." "We are home." "No," he smiled. "Now we go to our home, the main house. No more sleeping in the kitchen, Mrs. Caldwell. From now on you sleep beside me." He led her through the house. Their house now, to the room he'd prepared. It wasn't the room he'd shared with Sarah, but something new. A fresh start. The bed was piled with quilts. A fire crackled in the hearth. And on the nightstand sat the music box he'd given her, playing its soft waltz. "Jake," her voice broke, "it's perfect." "You're perfect." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "And you're mine. Finally completely mine." "Yours," she agreed. "And you're mine." They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, two people who'd been broken by loss and remade by love. Outside, the ranch settled into peaceful silence. Inside, Margaret and Jake Caldwell began the first night of their marriage, not with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but with quiet tenderness and the simple joy of no longer being alone. Margaret thought of the desperate widow who'd stepped off the stagecoach 4 months ago, clutching a torn advertisement and bleeding hands, certain she'd reached the absolute end of hope. She thought of Jake's challenge, that first-day cook with laughter bring joy to a kitchen that had forgotten how to smile. She'd done that and so much more. She'd found family in lonely cowboys. She'd discovered strength she didn't know she possessed. She'd learned that sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of something better. And as Jake kissed her goodnight and pulled her close under warm quilts, Margaret understood the truth that had been building since that first burned batch of biscuits. She hadn't come west seeking shelter. She'd come seeking herself. And in this kitchen, on this ranch, in the arms of this wounded, wonderful man, she'd finally found exactly who she was meant to be. Margaret Caldwell. Cook. Healer. Wife. Home. The Philadelphia widow was gone forever, replaced by a frontier woman who knew her worth, claimed her place, and understood that the greatest adventures often begin with the smallest acts of courage, like answering an advertisement, boarding a stagecoach, and trusting that somewhere out there, someone was waiting for exactly what she had to offer. Love, laughter, and the stubborn refusal to give up on hope, even when hope seemed like the most foolish thing in the world to hold on to. Jake's breathing deepened into sleep, but Margaret stayed awake a while longer, listening to the house settle around them. Tomorrow she'd wake in this new room, cook breakfast in her kitchen, tend her cowboys, and begin the daily work of building a life with Jake. There would be hard days ahead, droughts and storms, sickness and struggle, all the challenges frontier life could throw at them. But they'd face it together, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd have been given a second chance and were wise enough, brave enough, and grateful enough to seize it with both hands and never let go. And in the end, that was the only recipe that mattered, not for perfect biscuits or flawless pie, but for a life well lived and a love that seasoned every moment with exactly what Jake had asked for from the very beginning: laughter, hope, and the courage to keep choosing joy even when darkness threatened. Margaret Sullivan Caldwell closed her eyes and smiled her hand, finding Jake's even in sleep, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who'd finally, truly, completely come home.